Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, protests and politics in London.
I became the first vlogger ever in world history to ask a question at a summit conference.
What the alternative media saw at the G20. Accessing the internet and fighting censorship worldwide. Lost your memory stick? Why not install one in your finger? And life in the Twitter sphere. What's the point, anyway?
Right? It's gonna be okay. I've got to Twitter about this.
20 political leaders, 4 hours to discuss the state of the world and the biggest protests in the Western Hemisphere since the world economic meltdown. We're talking about the G20 summit of developed and emerging economies meeting in London. How well did the mainstream media cover the story? And was there a better alternative way of getting the real news? The meeting and the protests pitted the political establishment against many voices of global discontent, and the news media were divided as well, mainstream versus underground. The result, two quite different narratives being told in parallel. Our starting point this week, the global summit meeting in London, the protests and the tale of two stories.
It's been a day of politics at the very highest level, preparing for a day of tough talking tomorrow.
President Obama with the British Prime Minister, Obama with Hillary, Sarkozy with Hillary, Michelle Obama and the Queen.
The story, the mainstream version at least, started with the meet and greet. The images of global leaders getting together. Images that drove so much of the coverage the world saw on TV.
That it will show ordinary Americans who are suffering at home that he can deliver on a world stage.
Summits often end with the issuing of official communiques on what the leaders have agreed upon. Often those communiques are written before the event. Sometimes the media adopt a similar approach.
The mainstream media has, to a certain extent, made up their own agenda already, and they've decided what the stories are going to be before the summit even starts.
In this case, it's the arrival of the big man himself, Obama, and it's the story of the financial meltdown.
Like all summits, the main events of the G20 were choreographed in advance by government media handlers trying to control the story. Working against that, in parallel, were the protesters who had their own agenda and who had issues with the mainstream media and the way the protests were reported.
Okay, let's just talk to some of the protesters, perhaps. No, none of them want to talk to us about what's going on here.
From the very beginning, it seems that the mainstream media have an agenda of trying to marginalise these protests, make them seem as if that it's very much the fringes of society, and often they talk about anarchists and people who want to riot and don't really care for peace or justice or anything like that, when in fact the very opposite is true.
All they've gone for is the bit of violence that there was yesterday. There was a march from the US Embassy, maybe about 15,000 people, with speeches by leading politicians and activists and celebrities. That hardly got any mention. There was no violence at all.
The media is obviously going to focus on, as it does, on the extremes. The public aren't going to be interested in the reasonable group that's saying, well, on one hand this, on the other hand that, or yes, we're going to smash capitalism. You know, which way would you go as a journalist? I mean, I think it's obvious.
Obvious, but not necessarily illuminating. And in feeding their own addiction to conflict and to pictures of violence, did the mainstream media tell the real story?
I see both the protest and the politics as being important. I think that people are very angry, and I think that the protests show that at the grassroots level, there are a lot of people who are deeply concerned about how these conversations at high levels are going, and want to see real changes that will actually benefit the majority of people in the world.
Occasionally, the protesters' anger was directed directly at the mainstream media.
There's been an awful lot of hyperbole, but it's clear an awful lot does ride on what happens tomorrow. Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir. We had a man who came, a protester last night, who attacked me in the middle of a live and knocked me over, and then knocked our camera over, so I knocked him over, and he was arrested. So that's a negative reaction. He obviously didn't like Channel 4 and what Channel 4 was doing, so he made this point pretty forcefully.
The G20 summit was an example of how far social networks and bloggers have come in the news world. 50 bloggers from the G20 countries covered the meeting. The group was organized by Oxfam and largely paid for by the British Foreign Ministry.
I think that the bloggers are here in part to really be on the ground and provide eyewitness accounts of what's happening. We're non-professionals, and so we represent online communities of people who are also, non-experts on economics, but feel the impact of economics and of poverty and of climate change global governance, all of these issues in their daily lives.
You talk about the protests. This is like protesting, but in a safe way. It's real people really protesting. And so there are ways and means. And I think that the whole social media thing does give those small groups another way of getting their name out there.
One person at the summit who definitely gets the blogging thing was Sam Graham-Felsen. He ran Barack Obama's groundbreaking online election campaign.
The most valuable thing I think about blogging is the ability to give people a real nuanced understanding of what's happening. And that's where citizen journalists and bloggers can really come in and fill that gap and really paint a broad picture of what's going on.
They can also report back directly to their own online communities.
It feels kind of weird to be in the middle of this because this is like a huge event and all the world's eyes are watching, but it's important because Saudi Arabia is the only country from the Middle East at this event. It's good to have someone from Saudi Arabia who's not part of the government or the media, who's just a regular citizen.
The Saudi media's take on the G20 concentrated on who was meeting whom.
The Saudi media would usually restricted by the official red lines, and while it's better for me because I'm not like governed by the rules that govern the media, I'm free to say whatever I think and to give the picture the way I see it.
Is this the start of the end of tax havens, or is this the end of the end of tax havens?
This is the start of the end.
I became the first vlogger ever in world history to ask a question at a summit conference to a prime minister who had hosted the meeting.
But does handling the power to the blogosphere amount to a challenge for the mainstream media?
I don't think so at all, speaking from the African perspective. In the West, maybe there's a saturation of information, but then again, the analysis is what's important. The more people you have looking at a story and presenting different viewpoints on it, the better.
For the journalists and the cameras covering President Obama, this was a case of watching every move he makes. And they may not have noticed that the Obama effect has already changed the mainstream media forever.
Obama's candidacy and all of the energy and attention and community around that really catapulted our site into a new level of attention, legitimacy.
Just the fact that he was inaugurated and sworn in as President of the United States, in a sense, was validating of that idea that bloggers, that ordinary people can really make a profound impact, and it's not just me blogging, but, I'm blogging and bringing in my friend and my mom and maybe my grandma, to blog as well.
Here's how our Global Village voices see the coverage of the G20.
I think the G20 protests have, apart from being great fun to do, as protests always are, because you're just in the thick of it, most people have been very pleasant, very willing to speak to the media, because most people are protesting something they believe strongly in and they want to get it across. Occasionally you do get the hardcore anarchists, people who consider themselves radicals and think they're above talking to the media and perhaps blame the media for some of the problems.
I think the mainstream media do miss the point to a certain extent with things like this, because what they do is they cover the protests in a way which is showing the violence that might or might not come out of the protests, rather than actually focusing on the issues which the people are on the ground talking about. For example, a lot of people here yesterday were talking about climate change and that the G20 should be considering climate change in all of their actions. However, that hasn't filtered through to the media very easily.
Anyone looking to be one of our Global Village voices can either email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net or just go on Facebook and look for the Listening Post page. You can also follow us on Twitter. We'll let you know via Facebook and Twitter what stories we're working on and how you can get with the program and contribute to the broadcast. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. If a group of hardline clerics has its way, Saudi Arabian media will be banned from showing any pictures of women. The group of 35 clergymen has sent a message to the country's new information minister, Abdel Aziz Khoja, calling for the ban in both television and in print. They also want to prohibit the playing of music on television. Saudi newspapers and magazines currently publish pictures of women, but usually the women are wearing hijabs or headscarves. Saudi Arabia's former information minister, Ayad Madani, angered conservative religious forces years ago when he was the first to allow music on government-run TV channels, and he defied the country's gender segregation by allowing women journalists to interview men for the first time. Last week, we reported on 2 American reporters taken into custody by the authorities in North Korea. Now comes word that they will be prosecuted for illegally entering the country. The two, Yuna Lee and Laura Ling, were working on a story about North Korean refugees who had fled across the border and into China. North Korea's official news agency confirmed the two were being charged for illegal entry and for, quote, suspected hostile acts, unquote. The two reporters were on assignment for Current TV. That's the U.S.-based online channel, one of whose biggest backers is Al Gore. A Sudanese blogger has released a chilling account of his ordeal at the hands of police there. Abdel Hakim Nasser was arrested just hours after he showed his support online for the International Criminal Court's recent decision to issue an arrest warrant for the Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir. According to Nasser's statement, police raided his home at dawn and arrested him at gunpoint, and he says he was tortured. Memory sticks are handy little devices when you can find them. That's not a problem, though, for Finnish computer programmer Jari Jalava. Jalava had the misfortune of losing a finger in an accident last year and decided to fit his prosthetic replacement with a USB drive. Now he uses the 2-gigabyte drive to store documents, photos, and videos. 2 gigabytes is room enough for the video podcast of our show. Maybe we'll send Mr. Jalava the link to the podcast and see if he can play it off his finger. We're back after the break with a report on how to get around internet censorship wherever you are.